When Eleanor Marsh was thrown out of her stepfamily's home in the autumn of 1863, they handed her a single deed for a crumbling watermill on the edge of a silted river, valued by the county solicitor at less than £40. They called it her inheritance. They meant it as an insult, but buried beneath that rotting millstone, beneath years of deliberate neglect and one quiet man's careful deception, lay a secret that would change everything Eleanor thought she knew about her own name. Settle in, and let us travel back to the moorland edge of Derbyshire. In the autumn of 1863, the deed was folded in thirds and smelled of pipe smoke, and Eleanor Marsh did not open it until she was 3 miles down the road, and the Alderton house had disappeared behind the curve of the hill. She walked because there was no carriage offered. Her trunk, the small one, not the leather-cornered traveling case that had belonged to her mother, which Agnes had quietly appropriated 2 summers ago, sit balanced on the back of a borrowed farm cart, driven by a boy of perhaps 15, who had not said a single word to her since the yard. That was fine. Eleanor was accustomed to silence of the unwilling kind. She had lived inside it for 11 years. The morning was cold in the way that October mornings in Derbyshire were cold, not violent, not dramatic, but settled and certain, the way a fact is cold. The hedgerows had gone the color of old rust. The road ran between stone walls that had stood there longer than anyone's memory, and the sky above them was the color of unbleached wool. She unfolded the deed. Hartwell Mill, it read, situate upon the eastern bank of the River Sharrow, at the boundary of Alderton parish, comprising the mill house, the wheel housing, the granary loft, and appurtenant land, being the property of Thomas Marsh, deceased, and now conveyed in full to his daughter, Eleanor Ann Marsh, this 14th day of October, 1863, her father's name in print. She had not seen it in some time. The Alderton family did not speak of Thomas Marshnaut since his death in the spring of 1858, and not much before it either. He had been her mother's first husband, an inconvenience absorbed into the household when her mother remarried, a man who spent his hours with surveying tools and geological notebooks rather than with people, and who had died of a lung complaint at 44 with very little fuss, which the family found appropriate. Eleanor had been 19 when he died. She was 24 now. She refolded the deed and placed it inside her coat, close against her ribs. The cart boy set her trunk down at the edge of the Sharrow lane without being asked, collected the coin she pressed into his hand, and turned the cart back toward the village. Eleanor stood at the head of the lane for a moment. The lane was unpaved and soft from recent rain, and the wheel ruts ran deep between clumps of yellowed grass. Somewhere at the far end of it, according to the deed, was Hartwell Mill. She picked up one handle of the trunk, tilted it, and began to drag it. The mill came into view around a stand of willow sore, what remained of the willows, 3 of them, now mostly bare, their branches trailing in a river that barely deserved the name. The Sharrow had silted badly. Eleanor could see where the main channel had been, marked by a line of darker mud and the rusted iron teeth of a sluice gate that no longer moved. The water that remained ran in a thin, sullen braid across the exposed gravel and did not look capable of turning anything. The mill itself was stone, which was the best that could be said of it. Stone does not rot the way timber does. It surrenders more slowly and with less drama, but the roof of the granary loft on the north end had given way in at least 2 places, leaving black gaps visible against the pale sky. The main mill house stood more solidly 2 stories, thick walls, small windows with their wooden shutters warped outward from their frames. The wheel housing jutted from the south wall over the dried channel, and the wheel inside it, what Eleanor could see of it between the housing planks, was missing several of its paddles and had a visible crack across one of its main arms. The door was locked, but the lock was an old padlock threaded through an iron staple, and the staple had pulled halfway out of the doorframe. which was soft with damp. Eleanor set her trunk against the wall, took hold of the staple, and pulled it the rest of the way free with both hands. The padlock fell into the mud. She pushed the door open. The smell that came out was a compound thing: old grain dust, mouse droppings, mineral damp, and something underneath all of it that she could not name, yet something dry and faintly metallic, like the inside of a stone wall that has not been opened in a very long time. She stepped inside. The main room was perhaps 30 feet across. The millstones occupied the center, the great horizontal bedstone, fixed in place. The runner stone above it, gone, removed or fallen. The iron spindle that had once turned the runner stone jutted up from the bedstone like a broken tooth. Along the walls, the wooden bins that had once held grain had split along their joints, their contents long since gone to damp and rodents. 2 wooden chairs sat near the cold hearth, one of them missing a leg and propped against the wall. Eleanor walked to the center of the room and stood beside the millstone. The bedstone was perhaps 5 feet across, gray granite flecked with something that caught the light from the narrow window smica. She thought, the common kind. She had seen millstones before. Her father had brought her to mills sometimes, when she was small. On his surveying expeditions, he had liked machinery. He had liked to explain things to her in his careful, precise way, not because he thought she would need the knowledge, but because he believed that the world was worth understanding for its own sake. She rested her hand on the surface of the stone, and felt something she could not immediately account for. The bedstone sat on a wooden frame, which in turn sat on the stone floor, or should have. But the frame, where her weight shifted slightly against it, shifted back, not the rocking of a loose joint, something more like the give of a surface with nothing beneath it. Eleanor pressed her palm flat against the stone and pushed. Gently, the faintest resonance came up through her hand, not the dull solidity of stone laid on stone, but a hollow note, very faint, the kind of thing you could hear only if you were listening for nothing in particular. She straightened and looked down. The floor around the mill frame was stone flags, the same gray granite as the millstone. They looked solid. They looked as they had always looked. Eleanor knelt and ran her fingers along the seam between 2 of the flags nearest the frame and found the seam wider than it should have been, filled with dirt, packed in carefully, but wide enough to have been opened at some point and reset. She sat back on her heels in the cold, gray light. She did not know what to make of it. She was cold, and her arms ached from dragging the trunk, and there was no fire and no food, and the light would not last more than another 2 hours. She filed the hollow note away in the part of her mind where she kept things she had noticed and not yet understood, which was a practiced habit and a useful one, and she stood up and went to assess what, if anything, the mill had that could be made into shelter for the night. There was a fireplace in the back room, a smaller space that had served as the miller's quarters, with a pallet frame still standing along one wall and a low wooden table and an iron hook above the hearth. The chimney drew. Eleanor discovered this by stuffing a piece of rotted shutterwood up through it and finding that it moved air. The back room had no gaps in the ceiling. It had a window with a shutter that could be pulled mostly closed. These were its virtues. She brought her trunk in from outside. She found, in the corner of the granary, loft-reached by a ladder that held her weight, barely a pile of old straw that smelled of age but not of mold, and she carried armloads of it down and spread it on the pallet frame. She broke up 3 of the more rotten bin boards from the main room and built a fire, nursing it from a flint and steel she carried in her coat pocket, because she had learned, in 11 years of living in a house where she was never quite a priority, to carry her own. The fire caught. The room warmed, slightly. Eleanor sat on the pallet and ate the 2 pieces of bread and the end of hard cheese she had put in her coat that morning before the Aldertons were awake, because she had known, or half known, that this morning was coming and had prepared for it in the small way that was the only way she knew. She held the deed again in the firelight and read it through twice more. £40. That was the valuation. She knew what £40 meant. It meant a broken cart horse, or 2 months' wages for a junior clerk, or the contents of a modest parlor sold at auction. It meant a thing that was worth almost nothing. She thought about her father's hand, writing out this deed's original description, his careful, angular lettering. She had seen it in the surveying notebooks he left behind, the ones Agnes had thrown out, which Eleanor had retrieved from the refuse pile one at a time over the course of a week, and hid between her mattress and the bed slats. She thought about the hollow sound under the millstone. Outside, the wind moved through the willows and made a sound like water, and the real water, the thin braid of it, left in the shallow, ran on in the dark without purpose. Eleanor banked the fire, lay down on the straw-covered pallet with her coat pulled over her, and closed her eyes. She did not sleep for a long time, but she did not leave. The first week taught Eleanor what the mill would and would not give her. It would give her shelter, provisionally. The back room held against wind if she kept the shutter latched. The chimney drew adequately. The stone walls, 2 feet thick at the base, held the modest heat of the fire longer than any wooden structure would have. These were the things her father might have called structural advantages, offered without sentiment, as facts. It would not give her water from the shallow. The silt had thickened the channel to the consistency of clay in the shallow sections, and what ran in the deeper middle braid smelled of something upstream iron works, she suspected, given the rusty discoloration on the exposed gravel bars. She found a shallow well behind the granary loft instead, stone-lined, with a wooden cover half rotted through the water it gave. Once she had cleared the debris from the surface and let it settle, was cold and clean and tasted of limestone, which was the taste she associated with her father's surveying country and was therefore not unpleasant. She repaired the shutter of the main room window on the 3rd day, using a piece of board pulled from one of the broken grain bins and the small clasp knife she carried. She patched the worst of the granary roof gaps with thatch she cut from the overgrown margins of the lane. Imperfect work. Rough work. But it kept the rain from coming straight through. She learned which floorboards on the granary ladder held weight and which did not. And she learned the sound the door made when the wind pressure shifted, which was different from the sound it made when something outside actually moved. She was not, by training, a practical woman. She had been educated in the Alderton household's understanding of what a young woman required: needlework, adequate French, piano to the level of polite drawing-room competence, and the ability to manage a household staff, none of which skills were available to her here. But she had watched. She had always watched. 11 years in a house where she was not quite family had made her fluent in the small intelligences of maintenance, how things were kept from failing, how problems were prevented rather than solved, how much could be accomplished quietly before anyone noticed it needed doing. She traded labor for food. This required swallowing something she had no word for, not pride exactly, because she did not think of herself as proud, but a kind of privacy she had maintained around her circumstances. She walked to the village of Lower Sharrow, 1.75 miles up the lane, and presented herself at the back door of the public house and asked whether there was work. The woman who answered broad, capable, approximately 50, with flour on her apron and the expression of someone who had heard most things, looked Eleanor over with the frank assessment of the countryside and said there was, if she could peel vegetables and scour pots. Eleanor said she could. She worked 4 mornings that first week and was paid partly in coin and partly in food: a loaf, half a dozen eggs, a length of smoked pork that she made last 4 days. She did not complain. She did not explain her situation. She answered the questions that were asked of her. She was Thomas Marsh's daughter. She had inherited the mill. She was putting it in order and did not answer the ones that were not asked. It was on her 3rd morning at the public house that she heard the name Ned Barrow. One of the other women, working in the kitchen younger, quick-handed, named Clara mentioned him in the context of a dispute about the land survey markers on the south field. "Ask old Ned," Clara said, "not to Eleanor specifically. He knows every stone in this valley. Worked for half the landowners in 3 parishes before his hands went bad." "Which barrow?" the older woman asked. "Ned. Lives down at the end of Mill Lanatha, part nobody uses anymore. Past where the track goes to Moor." Eleanor filed this away. She found him 4 days later, almost by accidenter, what felt like accident, but was probably the result of taking the long way back from the well and allowing herself to follow the lane past the mill in the direction she had not yet explored. The track did narrow past a certain point, becoming more suggestion than road, and she nearly turned back. But then she saw the smoke from the cottage chimney, and then the cottage itself low, stone, with a garden patch that had gone half to seed, and a woodpile stacked with the neat efficiency of someone who took care over the 1 or 2 things they could still take care of. The man who answered her knock was perhaps 70. His hands, she saw immediately. They were badly affected. The joints, swollen and stiffened in the way that comes from decades of fine, repetitive work, followed by cold, and the way he held the door told her that gripping was painful. He had a narrow face, gray-white hair, and eyes of a color that was either pale blue or pale green depending on the light. And he looked at her for a long moment before he said, "You'll be Thomas Marsh's daughter." "It was not a question," Eleanor said. "I will." He opened the door wider. His name was Edward Barrow Nadand. He had been, for 12 years, a tool dresser and sometimes surveying assistant, working with the small geological expeditions that occasionally moved through the Derbyshire moorland in the 1840s and 1850s. Men looking for coal seams or iron deposits or water sources. He had worked with Thomas Marsh over the course of 3 separate seasons, between 1849 and 1854. "Your father," he said, pouring tea into cups that did not match, "knew this ground better than any proper engineer I ever saw, better than men who had gone to university for it. He had a way of reading the land, the way the water moved underground, the way the stone presented at the surface that was more instinct than training. And I say that having watched men with training, he never spoke of it much." Eleanor said, "No, he wouldn't." Ned set the teapot down with some care, using both hands. Quiet man, but systematic. He kept records of everything, every survey, every sample, every note. Not just the field notebook, separate maps. His own symbols, half of them. Something in Eleanor's chest went still. "Maps," she said. "Ah, yeah." He had a method of overlaying geological information with a hand-drawn base map, using his own notation. I never learned all of Ithe was private about it, but I understood enough to know what I was looking at. He wrapped both hands around his cup. "I'll tell you something I never told anyone else. Because you're his daughter, and because the man is dead, and there's no harm in it now. The last season I worked with him 54. Autumn took me down to Hartwell Mill for 2 days. Told me he was documenting the ground beneath the mill house for a county survey. But that wasn't what he was doing." Eleanor waited. Ned looked at his tea. He was mapping something specific. Something under the foundation. He wouldn't tell me what. Not directly. But he was careful. More careful than you are for a county survey. And when we left, he sealed something in the wall of the granary loft. I watched him do it. He told me not to mention it, and I didn't. "In the granary wall," Eleanor repeated, "behind the wooden paneling on the east wall. Second panel from the north end." He looked up at her. "I assume you've found the mill to be somewhat more interesting than its valuation suggests." Eleanor thought about the hollow sound beneath the millstone. She thought about the wide seam between the flags. "I am beginning to think so," she said. She went back to the mill that afternoon and found the panel without difficulty. It was the only section of the east wall that was paneled at all, a remnant of some earlier attempt to make the granary loft more weather-resistant. 3 boards across, and perhaps 4 feet high. The second board from the north end was held by 2 wooden pegs rather than the nails the others used. She pulled the pegs, lifted the board away, and reached into the cavity behind it. What she found was a roll of oilskin, tied with a cord that had gone stiff and dark with age, but held. She carried it down the ladder to the main room and set it on the stone rim of the millstone. The only flat surface, she trusted and untied the cord. Inside the oilskin were 4 sheets of heavy drafting paper. Folded together, she unfolded them carefully, one at a time. The top sheet was a mapor, the skeleton of one. She recognized the general shape of the Sharrow Valley, the river's course. The mill building rendered in precise outline. The lane, the well. The 4 cardinal points, marked in her father's angular hand. But overlaid on this familiar geography was a second system of notation she did not recognize. Symbols in groups, arranged in patterns, with numbers beside them that did not correspond to any measurement she could identify. Lines ran between some symbols in dotted curves. Others were circled, twice or 3 times. In the lower right corner, her father had written a series of letters and numbers that might have been a key, or might have been something else entirely. The second sheet was similar, but showed a cross-section of view from the side, she thought, showing depth layers. The third was a detailed close-up of the area immediately beneath the mill building, with the stone flags shown from above and the foundation walls in profile, and the space beneath them marked in a way that suggested chambers or channels she could not yet interpret. The fourth sheet was a letter. The handwriting was her father's, but looser than his usual precision, the hand of someone writing quickly, or under some urgency, and the date at the top read the 12th of March. Item Baba Wushitsi. She read only the first line before she heard the sound of boots on the lane outside. She re-rolled the oilskin, tied the cord, and slid the roll inside her coat with the automatic efficiency of someone who has learned to hide things quickly. She was at the window when the knock came, at the door. Confident knock. The knock of someone who did not anticipate not being answered. She opened the door. The man on the step was perhaps 50, well-dressed for the county rather than the city, with a dark coat and a hat that was slightly too good for the mud on the lane. He had a pleasant face arranged into an expression of pleasant concern, and he held a leather folder under his arm. "Miss Marsh," he said, "I am so glad to find you in residence. My name is Silas Croft. I serve as land agent and manager for the Alderton estate, and I have been meaning to call on you since your arrival." He smiled. "I am afraid I bring somewhat complicated news regarding the mill property, a matter of an existing lease agreement that may affect your plans here. Whenever you are ready, I would be grateful for a few minutes of your time." Eleanor looked at him. She looked at the leather folder. She thought about the oilskin against her ribs. "Of course," she said. "Please come in." Silas Croft stayed for 20 minutes and left Eleanor with a copy of a document she did not trust. The document was a lease agreement, dated the 3rd of September, 1852, 1 year before Eleanor's father's final surveying season at Hartwell Mill, and 6 years before his death. It bore what appeared to be Thomas Marsh's signature on the second page, along with the seal of the Alderton estate. Its terms granted the Alderton estate's land agent referred to in the document as the appointed manager the right to use and develop the western portion of the Hartwell Mill grounds, including the area beneath and immediately surrounding the mill foundation, for a period of 20 years. That term would not expire until 1872. "You understand," Croft had said, his voice warm with the particular warmth of someone delivering a problem wrapped in sympathy, "that I take no pleasure in presenting this. The property is yours. Absolutely, I would not suggest otherwise. It is only this one matter of the western grounds that complicates things slightly. My client, the Alderton estate, has maintained its interest here in good faith throughout, and I know it must be unwelcome news." Eleanor had looked at the document. She had said, carefully, "I will need time to review this." "Of course," he had said. "Of course." After he left, she stood in the empty main room for a long time, without moving. Then she unrolled the oilskin and spread the maps on the millstone rim and looked at the cross-section sheet. The one showing depth layers and looked at the detailed floor plan beneath it, and found the western boundary Croft had described in the lease. She traced it with her finger. The western grounds in that document encompassed precisely the area her father had marked most heavily on the close-up map. The symbols clustered there. The dotted lines converged there. The flags with the wide seams between them, the ones she had found on her first night, the ones that gave back a hollow sound were there. She sat down on the one intact chair, set the maps in her lap, and began, very carefully and very slowly, to think. She went to Ned Barrow the following morning, before dawn had fully given way to the gray October light, with the oilskin under her arm and a question she did not yet know how to ask. She did not need to ask it. Ned opened the door, looked at the roll under her arm, and said, "You found it." "Last evening," Eleanor said, "and I received a visitor." She told him about Croft and the lease while he made the fire larger. He listened without interrupting, which she had come to recognize as his manera, listening that was not passive but active and considered, the listening of someone who has spent decades watching, as she had. When she finished, he said, "Show me the maps." She unrolled them on his table. He stood over them for a while without touching them, only looking. His swollen hands held slightly away from the paper. Then he said, "Bring me that candle." She brought it. He held it close to the first sheet, the overview, and traced the symbols with the tip of one finger, not touching, hovering a quarter-inch above the surface. "I know most of these," he said. "The circles with the crossbar, that's his notation for quartz-bearing rock. The dotted lines are his estimate of the vein's direction, underground. These numbers here are depths, in feet, below the surface at that point." He moved the candle to the cross-section sheet. "This is a profile view. He's showing the geology in layers." His finger traced the lowest layer, down here, below the mill foundation, below the claythus hatching. That's his symbol for mineralized zone. Mineralized with what Eleanor asked. Ned straightened slowly, set the candle back, and looked at her. "I knew there was something here," he said. "I told you he wasn't doing a county survey, but I didn't know what it was until he sealed that packet in the wall and told me to say nothing. And I thought it might be one kind of thing, but I didn't let myself think it clear." He was quiet for a moment. "Your father showed me one specimen, the last day. He'd taken it from below the mill, foundation he'd dug down 4 feet through the floor flags one night. He must have, and then relayed them." He held it out in his palm. It was a piece of quartz, not large, size of a hazelnut, but threaded through with something. Yellow, not iron yellow. The false kind, the other kind. Eleanor heard the words before she understood them. Then she understood them. "There's gold," she said. "There was a vein." Ned said, "Whether it's still there, whether it was ever more than a small pocket, I don't know. Your father would have known. But yes, that's what he was mapping." He looked at the floor plan sheet, at the cluster of heavy symbols in the western section. "And that's what your Mr. Croft is after." Eleanor understood. Then, what the lease document was and what it was not. It was not, she thought, a legitimate agreement. Her father had been secretive about the mill. Ned had said so, and the sealed oilskin confirmed it because he had not trusted the Alderton family with the knowledge of what lay beneath it. A man who distrusted them enough to leave his discovery in code, sealed in a wall, with a letter he had addressed to his daughter when she was 14 years old. would not have signed a lease giving them the right to excavate the foundation, but she could not prove this. Not yet. The signature on the lease might be genuine forged documents in 1863, were not so extraordinary as to be inconceivable. But genuine signatures were more common than forgeries, and she could not assume fraud without evidence. What she needed was the letter, the fourth sheet in the oilskin, the one she had begun to read and then hidden when Croft knocked. She read it that night. She had been right that the handwriting was looser than her father's usual hand. She understood, reading it, why he had been ill when he wrote it. He referred to his illness directly in the third paragraph. I am told my lungs will not carry me much further into next year, and I find I must write this now, rather than wait for a better moment that may not come. He had died the following spring. The letter was addressed to her by name. It began, "My dear Eleanor." She had to stop at that and sit with it for a moment, because her father had not been a man who used endearments easily, and seeing it on the page "Me dear Eleanorin," his handwriting was a different thing from what she had expected, though she could not have said what she had expected. He wrote that he had discovered, in the autumn of 1849 on his first season at Hartwell Mill, what he believed to be a significant gold-bearing quartz vein running beneath the mill foundation. He had spent 5 years documenting it carefully and extracting a small number of specimens. Referred to these as being stored in the chamber below the millstone, which he described in detail: the flags with the reset seams, the hollow beneath, the wooden-lidded stone box he had built there. He had told no one except Ned Barrow, in incomplete terms, because I do not trust the Aldertons with this knowledge, and I mean no insult to your mother in saying so. He had not pursued the formal mining claim that would have been required to extract the vein properly, because doing so would have required disclosing the location, and he did not believe the claim would be respected. "The mill is yours, by right of my original ownership," he wrote, "which predates your mother's remarriage and is not subject to any claim from that family. I have arranged with my solicitor in Bakewell, Mr. James Aldous, of Rutland Street, for the deed to come to you directly in the event of my death, bypassing the estate entirely, which I was entitled to do, as it was my property alone before I married. I do not know when you will find this. I do not know how old you will be, or what circumstances you will be in, but I built the chamber carefully, and the oilskin will hold, and I believe you will be thorough enough to find it. The maps will tell you everything the ground can tell you. Trust them. And Eleanor, there may be people who claim rights to the mill grounds that were never legitimately theirs. I have signed nothing of that kind. If you see my name on such a paper, it is not my name." She read that line 3 times. "If you see my name on such a paper, it is not my name." She waited until the following morning to look at the chamber. She had been avoiding it not from fear, exactly, but from a superstition she did not quite believe, in the feeling that the thing beneath the floor was in some sense still her father's, and that opening it was an action she needed to be ready for rather than impulsive about. When she was ready, she went to Ned Barrow's cottage and asked him to come. He came without hesitation, bringing only a lantern and a short-handled chisel in case the flags needed encouragement. They did not. The seams, once Eleanor had cleared the packed dirt from them with the blade of her clasp knife, were wide enough to take her fingers. The flags lifted cleanly. Her father had reset them to lift, she realized, not to stay permanently down. He had designed this to be found by someone who was paying attention. Ned held the lantern down into the space below. The chamber was perhaps 3 feet deep and 4 feet across, stone-lined on all sides, with a fitted wooden lid set in the base that had swollen slightly with moisture but lifted when Eleanor pried at its edge. The inside was dry. Her father had pitched the box with some kind of seal. She could see the dark residue around the lid's edge end it had held. Inside the box were 7 cloth bags, tied at the neck. Eleanor lifted one. It weighed more than she expected from its size. She untied the neck and poured a small amount of the contents into her palm. Quartz fragments, gray-white, and threaded through them, in thin, bright seams and occasional flakes, the yellow that was not the false kind. She closed her hand around the fragments and held them. Ned said, very quietly, "Well." Eleanor said nothing. She was thinking of her father's hand, the particular length of his fingers, the ink stain he always had on the side of his right index finger holding these same fragments, perhaps in this same spot, and deciding to seal them here rather than anywhere they might be found and taken from her. She reached back into the box and found, beneath the last 2 bags, a folded piece of paper separate from the letter. It was a rough list, in her father's hand, of weights and rough assessments. Sample 1 approx. Vier Unze, quartz. Visible gold, perhaps 15-20 grains. Sample 2 similar weight. Denser mineralization, and so on through all 7 bags. At the bottom of the list was a total, with a conversion. Estimated gold content by weight. All samples combined 6.8 troy ounces, at current London price per troy ounce, £3 12s. Estimated value of samples alone, £21, 29. And then, below that, in slightly different ink, as if added later, the vein itself, fully worked. By the geological profiles, impossible to estimate without proper assay, but the formation is consistent with productive Cornish lode-type deposits. I believe the full value may be very considerable. Very considerable. Her father's careful understatement. Eleanor could hear exactly how he would have said those words. The precise, deliberate flatness of them, meaning something large that he was not willing to overstate before the evidence was fully in. She put the paper back in the box. She replaced the wooden lid. She looked up at Ned, who was watching her with the lantern held steady and an expression she could not fully read in the low light. "The letter says he signed nothing," she said. "If there's a lease with his signature, the signature is false. That'd be fraud." Ned said, "A serious matter." "Yes," Eleanor said, "it would be." She lifted the cloth bags out of the box, one by one, and laid them on the stone floor beside the open chamber. 7 bags. The candle-yellow flicker of the lantern caught the quartz fragments through the cloth and gave them a glow they had not asked for and did not need. She needed a solicitor, not the Alderton family's solicitor. Her owner, rather, her father's James Aldous, of Rutland Street, Bakewell. Bakewell was 14 miles from Lower Sharrow, which meant a full day's journey on foot or half a day with the carrier's cart that ran between the market villages on Thursdays. Eleanor went on a Thursday, with the oilskin maps secured inside her coat alongside the letter and the list of sample weights. She did not take the specimen bag. She had returned them to the chamber and reset the flags. But she took the 4th map sheet with the foundation plan and the letter, and she took the lease copy Croft had left with her, folded carefully inside the maps. She had spent 2 nights before the journey doing what she was better at than she had ever admitted, sitting quietly with evidence and making herself think about it without rushing to conclusions. She did this not from confidence, but from the opposite of it, from a long habit of doubting her own perceptions enough to check them twice, 3 times, from every available angle before trusting them. It was the quality she most resented in herself, this reflexive second-guessing. And it was also, she was beginning to understand, the quality that had kept her from being entirely wrong. What she had a letter from her father, explicitly stating he had signed nothing affecting the mill grounds, 4 maps, coded but partially deciphered, showing a geological formation of significant potential value directly beneath the area described in Croft's lease. 7 bags of mineral specimens stored in a sealed chamber that Croft's lease would give him the right to access, and which he clearly had not yet accessed, or the chamber would not have been intact, and a deed for the property with no encumbrances listed. What she did not have proof that the signature on the lease was forged. Her father's statement in the letter was evidence of intent, not forensic proof. She would need someone who knew her father's hand well. She thought about who that might be. James Aldous, of Rutland Street, Bakewell, was a small, careful man in his mid-60s who wore a very clean coat and spoke with the deliberate precision of someone who had spent 40 years knowing that imprecise words caused expensive problems. His office was above a bookseller's shop and smelled of leather and cedar and old paper, all of which Eleanor found unexpectedly steadying. She had written ahead a brief note delivered by the Thursday carrier the week before, identifying herself as Thomas Marsh's daughter and requesting an appointment. He had been expecting her. "I handled your father's affairs for the last 8 years of his life," he said, when she had sat down, "including the arrangements for the deed." He was quite specific about what he wanted. He looked at her with the assessing look of a man who was deciding how much he could say. "He spoke of you," Eleanor said. "He left a letter. In the mill." "I know about the letter," Aldous said. "He told me it existed, though not its contents. He said that if you ever came to me, I should tell you that I have a copy of the property deed and that the deed is clino encumbrances. No attached agreements. No leases." Eleanor took the Croft lease copy from her coat and placed it on his desk. Aldous picked it up. He read it. His expression did not change, which Eleanor had already come to recognize as the professional substitute for an expression. He read it twice, set it down, and said, "Where did you receive this?" "From a man named Silas Croft. He presented himself as land agent for the Alderton estate." "I know Croft by reputation," Aldous said, which was not exactly an endorsement. He looked at the signature page of the lease. He was quiet for a long moment. "Miss Marsh, I have a considerable number of documents with your father's signature in this office. If you will permit me, I would like to compare this signature with those I hold." Eleanor said she would permit him. He spent perhaps 10 minutes at his files. He returned to the desk with 2 documents, a letter and a property survey record, both signed by Thomas Marshand, laid them beside the lease copy. He set them side by side and looked at them for a while without speaking. Using a small magnifying glass he produced from his desk drawer, then he said, "The horizontal stroke of the M and the terminal flourish on the H in Marsh. Your father had a very individual hand." He set the magnifier down. "This is not his signature." Eleanor had known it. She had known it from her father's letter, and she had known it from the way Croft's document described exactly the area her father had been most careful to obscure from anyone else's knowledge. She had known it for days, but hearing it stated in the flat, the certain voice of a man who had spent 40 years reading documents, made something in her chest loosen in a way that she had not expected. She took a breath. "I need to know," she said, carefully. "What can be done?" Aldous told her. "It was not," he explained. "A simple matter, nothing involving forged documents and competing property claims was simple. But it was not complicated in the way that things complicated by genuine legal ambiguity were complicated. The foundation was solid. She had a clean deed. She had a letter from the deceased property owner explicitly disclaiming the agreement. She had a solicitor with original comparative documents. The most likely proceeding was a petition to the county magistrate to invalidate the lease on the grounds of forgery, supported by the comparative handwriting analysis, with the original deed as the primary instrument. "It will take time," Aldous said. "These things take time. But Miss Marsh, I would advise you, in the interim, not to leave the property unoccupied for any extended period." Eleanor thought of the reset flags and the chamber beneath them. "I had no intention of doing so," she said. She was 4 miles from Lower Sharrow on the return journey, riding the Thursday carrier's cart back through the darkening afternoon. when she understood what she needed to do before Aldis's petition could be filed and before the process could begin to work. She needed Croft to know that she knew. Not from aggression, Eleanor did not operate from aggression. She had never had the luxury of it, but because the alternative was to allow him to proceed in the assumption that she was ignorant and therefore manageable. And that assumption was now his primary advantage. She arrived at the mill just after dark and built the fire and ate, and she was still awake 2 hours later, sitting with the letter in her lap, when she made herself look at what she was actually afraid of. She was afraid of being wrong. Not factually wrong. Aldis had given her the factual confidence she needed. She was afraid of the specific version of wrong that meant she would speak up, make her claim, and then discover that speaking up accomplished nothing, that the world would look at Thomas Marsh's thin, quiet daughter with her rolled-up maps and her sealed chamber and her dead man's letter, and find some reason that she was still the one who had to leave. She sat with this fear for a while. She looked at it from various angles, the way she had been taught to look at evidence. She asked herself if the fear was informative, if it was telling her something true about the situation, or if it was simply the residue of 11 years of a particular kind of life. She thought it was mostly the latter. She folded the letter back into the oilskin. Croft came on a Monday morning, 3 days later, with 2 men from the estate workers, by their clothes, carrying tools. He came down the mill lane with the brisk confidence of someone executing a planned operation, and Eleanor was standing in the doorway when he arrived, which she suspected disrupted his plans slightly. "Miss Marsh," he said, with the same warmth as before, professionally warm, the warmth of someone who had decided warmth was the most efficient approach. "I hope I find you well. I have arranged, with the estate's authorization, to begin a minor survey of the western grounds entirely, in keeping with the terms of the lease agreement I provided you." Eleanor looked at the tools the men were carrying. A mattock, 2 spades, and a metal bar that was specifically designed for levering stone flags. She looked back at Croft. Something settled in her. Not calm exactly, but the state that exists beyond calm, when the decision has been made and the only thing left is to speak. She had spent a very long time being quiet, and she was aware, in this moment, that the quiet was about to end, and that she was the one ending it. "Mr. Croft," she said, "I visited Mr. Rand, James Aldis, in Bakewell last Thursday. He is my father's solicitor and holds the original property deed, which carries no encumbrances of any kind." She paused, not for effect, but because the next sentence needed to be exact. "Mr. Aldis has compared the signature on the lease you provided with original documents bearing my father's signature. His professional assessment is that the signatures are not made by the same hand." Croft's expression did not change, but the quality of his stillness changed. "He will be filing a petition with the county magistrate this week to have the lease voided on those grounds." Eleanor continued, "He has copies of everything. I have copies of everything, held separately." She looked at the men with the tools. "I would ask you to return to the estate and not to bring anyone onto this property again until the magistrate has ruled. If you do come onto this property before that ruling, I will treat it as trespass." She said the word trespass as clearly as she said every other word. She did not raise her voice. She did not step back from the doorway. Croft looked at her for a long moment. She watched him calculate as she could see it happening. The rapid adjustment of his assessment of the situation. He had come here expecting the woman who had stood in her own doorway 11 days ago, polite and careful and not quite willing to say anything direct. He had misjudged the distance between that woman and this one, and Eleanor could see the moment he understood that he had misjudged it. He said, very pleasantly, "I see. I will consult with my client." "Please do," Eleanor said. He turned and spoke quietly to the 2 workers, and the 3 of them walked back up the lane. Eleanor stood in the doorway and watched them until the lane curved and they were gone. Her heart was loud in her chest. Her hands were entirely steady. She went inside, put the kettle on the fire, and sat down at the low table. Outside, the sharrow ran in its thin autumn braid over the gravel, and the willows made their water sound in the wind. And somewhere higher on the moor, a curlew called once and then was quiet. The hearing before the county magistrate was held on the 22nd of November, in a room above the town hall in Bakewell that smelled of wood smoke and old wool and the particular staleness of disputes settled and disputes pending. Eleanor sat beside Aldous at a long table covered with a green baize cloth that had gone thin at the corners. Croft sat at a table across from them with a solicitor from Derby whom Eleanor did not know. The magistrate was a heavy-set man named Deverell, who wore his authority without drama and appeared to have read everything Aldous submitted before the hearing, which Eleanor had not expected and which reassured her more than anything else in the room. The hearing lasted 2 hours. Deverell asked Aldous to explain the handwriting discrepancy first. Aldous did so, bringing his comparative documents and demonstrating the specific divergences, the M stroke, the terminal flourish, 3 additional points of inconsistency he had identified in the interim weakened methodical sequence. Croft's solicitor challenged the comparative methodology. Aldous responded. Deverell asked several questions that were precise and that suggested he understood what he was being told. Croft's solicitor then made the argument that the lease had been in continuous possession of the estate for 11 years without challenge, implying that its legitimacy had been accepted by Thomas Marsh through his inaction. Aldous produced the letter with Eleanor's permission, given beforehand, and read the relevant passage. I have signed nothing of that kind. If you see my name on such a paper, it is not my name. He did not read the earlier, more personal portions. He read only what was necessary. Deverell looked at the lease. He looked at the comparative documents. He looked at the letter. He said, I find the evidence of forgery sufficient to invalidate this instrument. The lease is void. The property remains with Miss Marsh unencumbered. Costs to the estate. The room was quiet for a moment. Then Aldous began to gather his papers with the focused efficiency of a man who had gotten what he came for and saw no reason to linger. Eleanor sat still for a moment longer. She did not feel triumphant. She felt the particular sensation of something being set down that had been carried for a long time joyful. Not dramatic, only lighter than before. The room was very ordinary around her. The baize cloth was thin at the corners. The window above the magistrate's chair showed a rectangle of gray November sky. She picked up her gloves and stood. Silas Croft, on his way out, passed within 3 feet of her. He did not look at her. She did not require him to. Later, she learned that he resigned his position as land agent for the Alderton estate the following week. She did not learn this with satisfaction or without it. She filed it alongside everything else she had learned in the past 6 weeks as a fact, worth knowing. And not more than that. She went back to Hartwell Mill in the last light of that November afternoon, arriving after dark, finding the fire low but still alive. She had learned to bank it correctly now. He had learned all the particular behaviors of this hearth hand. She rebuilt it, and she sat for a long time without doing anything in particular. She thought about her father. She thought about what he had built here. In the years when she had known him only as the man who came home from his surveying trips with mud on his boots and odd stones in his pockets and occasional careful explanations of how granite formed or how you could read the direction of underground water from the way the land sloped, she had not known, then, that any of it was for her specifically. Children rarely know when a parent is preparing something for them, because the preparation looks like ordinary life from the inside. He had known, she thought, that he was dying well before the lung complaint became undeniable. He had known it, and he had used the time to build something that could outlast him and reach her. Even through 11 years of the wrong household, and a deliberate devaluation and a crumbling door that opened into mud, he had encoded the maps because he could not trust that the right person would find them. He had written, "I believe you will be thorough enough," because he had known her well enough, had paid attention well enough, to bet on her thoroughness over anyone else's. She had not known he was betting on her. She reached into her coat and took out the letter and unfolded it for what she thought was probably the 7th or 8th time. She did not read it again. She just held it in the firelight, the way you hold something that is not the person, but is the closest thing to them that remains. Her father had been a quiet man. He had not, in his life, been much regarded. He had spent his years looking carefully at the ground that other people walked across without noticing, and he had found something worth finding, and he had protected it until it could reach the person he believed would know what to do with it. That was what he had done with his life. The rest the household, the remarriage. The years of being peripheral to someone else's story had been the circumstances. This had been the work. She folded the letter. She put it back inside her coat. Outside, the wind had dropped, and she could hear the Sharrow more clearly without it, thin as it was. The water moving over the stones in the dark, making the sound of water that is always, in every season, the same sound. Spring came to the Sharrow Valley in the way that spring comes to moorland country, not in a rush, but in a slow, considered loosening, the frost retreating from the stones by degrees, the willows greening from the tips inward, the water in the river rising with the snowmelt from the higher ground until it ran properly again in its channel. For the first time, in local memory, suggested perhaps 15 years, Hartwell Mill did not grind grain in the spring of 1864. The wheel was not repaired, and Eleanor did not intend to repair it. Not yet, and possibly not for some time. The legal proceedings regarding the mineral rights, a separate matter from the lease, requiring a separate application to the relevant mining commission in Derby, were still in their early stages. Managed by Aldous with the careful, unhurried pace of a man who knew that moving too quickly was its own kind of error. The specimens remained in the chamber. The flags were reset. The mill, from the outside, looked as it had always looked, a crumbling stone building by a silted river that was worth almost nothing. Eleanor had made a number of small repairs that were not visible from the road. The back room was weather-tight now, and warm when the fire was properly banked. The granary loft was stable enough to store things in. The well cover was new, solid timber, with a good latch. She had planted a kitchen garden in the plot behind the granary, working it with a spade borrowed from Ned and returned with some eggs, and it was showing its first uncertain green. On a Thursday morning in the 2nd week of April, she sat on the front step with a cup of tea and watched Ned Barrow make his slow way down the lane, carrying a small sack that turned out to contain 2 seed potatoes and a piece of salt pork wrapped in cloth. "Thought you might be low on stores," he said, which was accurate. He sat on the step beside her. There was room, just barely, and they drank their tea in the thin spring sunlight without much conversation, which was the kind of company they had both, in their different ways, spent their lives preferring. The Sharrow ran in the channel. A pair of gray wagtails worked the exposed stones at the edge of the water. The willows showed yellow-green against the brown of the moor above, and on the higher ground the sheep were moving in the slow, deliberate way that sheep move when the ground is newly open to them. After a while, Ned said, "What will you do with it, when everything's settled?" Eleanor thought about the question. She had been thinking about it, in the way she thought about things, not arriving at an answer, but letting the answer arrive when it was ready. "I don't know yet," she said. "Something my father would have found worth doing with it. I think—" Ned nodded, which meant he understood this, because he had known Thomas Marsh. Eleanor set down her empty cup and went inside and came back with her coat. And from the coat, she took the small notebook she had bought in Bakewell on her last trip to see Aldous plane cover. Good paper, the kind of notebook that was made to be used for a long time. She had not written anything in it yet. She had been waiting, she thought now. without quite knowing what she was waiting for. She opened it to the first page. The page was white and unmarked and patient, the way that a page is always patient, waiting to be told what it is for. She took the pencil from her paqueta, short one, worn down from some previous use, bought secondhand from the Bakewell stationer, and she held it above the paper for a moment. She thought about what she had learned in 6 months. The sound a hollow stone makes when you press your hand against it. The specific gravity of quartz with gold-bearing mineralization. How to peel a shutter from a frame and refit it so it would hold. How long a fire could be kept alive on minimal fuel. How to read a man's face when he was recalculating. How to say this is fraud in a room where the words would count. She wrote the date, 14th of October to 10th of April. She wrote the name Hartwell Mill. She began to write. Outside, Ned's teacup sat empty on the step, and the wagtails worked the stones, and the Sharrow ran clear and high in its recovered channel, carrying the snow melt from the moor down through the valley and away to wherever water goes when it has done what it came here to do.